Welcome back. In this video, I'll be covering Learning Objective 12.3, explain how observing violence increases violent behavior for PSY 235 Social Psychology. A lot of the research that surrounds this broad question about the impact of observing violent behavior comes from the debate at the cultural level, as well as the research in social psychology and other disciplines on media exposure to violent behavior. For as long as there has been media that has presented violence, I don't care whether it's books or images or radio stories or television or film, whatever it is, there has always been a debate that, especially if we show such things to vulnerable people, to children, to adolescents, even adults, but a lot of the debate has been about kids. When we show them those images, is it going to make them more likely to engage in actual aggressive behavior? Now, this is really hard to study. It shouldn't surprise you that there are ethical issues when we want to try and study the effects of exposure to violent content. From an experimental standpoint, we can't put people in a laboratory and have them do violence to other people. I mean, the actual violence. We can't let people hurt each other, get into fist fights, use weapons, whatever. It's absolutely unethical, and we can't do it. So what Stanley Milgram did was he created a scenario that people found believable, that they were inflicting harm on another human being by pressing a button that they believed was eliciting or causing an electric shock to be delivered to this other person. So that kind of manipulation, that kind of task, has been commonplace in the aggression literature, where you create, a mechanism. You put people in a game-playing situation. You maybe frustrate them, insult them, whatever. You provoke them. And they're given an opportunity to lash out. And the way that they lash out is usually pushing a button that delivers an unpleasant stimulus, at least in terms of the belief of the participant. Sometimes it's pushing a button to deliver white noise, loud white noise, into a set of headphones. Sometimes it's believing that you are inflicting a shock on another person. So with that in mind, let's look at what we know. When we watch violent media, so media that depicts aggressive, violent behaviors, it does tend, when we put people physiological measures in play, it increases their level of physiological arousal. It increases their ratings of their level of excitement. It does have a tendency to encourage people to imitate the behaviors that they've seen. It can prime thoughts of aggression and also expectations. It can become a filter through which we view other people. So, for instance, if you have watched a lot of violent media and then you are in a social encounter, you may be more suspicious of their motives. And also, it activates a whole host of social scripts where we tend to use the same words or use the same postures when we learn them from watching media violence exposures. Most of the research indicates that when we watch a lot of violent media, there is a tendency for aggression to increase. Angry emotions tend to increase and hostile thoughts increase. However, remember what the rules are here. We don't get to put people in actual, authentic situations where they can engage in real violent behavior on another person. So we don't put them in an actual context where they can hit someone, or punch someone, or kick someone, or inflict any other kind of violence on them. That's unethical. So within the kind of sterile environment that we have, this is what's been found, is that exposure to media violence tends to be disinhibiting. It also tends to be arousing and exciting, and it tends to be tethered to all kinds of ideas and beliefs that we have about aggression that we've seen in the media. So when we're studying media violence, having a lot of anecdotes isn't enough. We really have to look at experimental data and then link that to the correlational data and then draw some conclusions. And what we know for a fact is that the experimental research does show an effect. However, the research is not consistent. Some of the experimental findings show small effects, some show no effects, some show moderate effects. It's rare for them to show large effects. And it's in that really artificial kind of environment where the type of aggression that people are exhibiting is very foreign to them. I mean, I don't know how many of you walk around with a shock generator in your pocket where you can use that on other people that you're angry with. I don't, so there. Actively playing games, and there's been a lot of debate about this, and if you want to get into a drop-down fight with a bunch of gamers, throw this out on the table. But in research in the laboratory about violent video games, playing those, particularly the first-person shooter type games, does seem to have an impact in experimental situations. Now remember the rules, you have to do it ethically. So when people have been playing violent video games, like the first-person shooter type games, these tend to be very immersive experiences. They tend to be very engaging. They tend to be very physiologically arousing, meaning people's sympathetic nervous system tends to get all fight or flighty. Then, if you get them playing that game and then you create a frustration context or a competition context and give people the opportunity to act out and punish someone that they're playing against, they will do so more often and more actively. And if you give them the option of turning up the voltage on their fake shock generator, they'll do that more too. And that's in comparison to playing non-violent video games or pacifist games, cooperative games. So video games do appear to have an effect. Now, does that mean that exposure to violent video games outside of the laboratory is going to translate into actual violent behavior? That's a more difficult question to answer. Games actually reinforce behaving aggressively in that virtual environment. It actually, your success in the game is related to how many kills that you have frequently. So what this can do is it teaches people aggressive scripts. It also, especially if you're talking about young people, it can increase their level of feelings of hostility, of aggressive thoughts, and it can make those aggressive acts more likely. So another example that's been shown with game playing is if you have people playing in the same space, and some of this is observational research, so it's a little wonky. You have people playing shooter games in the same space. Their incidences of physical contact with one another that's aggressive in nature tends to drift upward, but that's more observational research. What we need to be able to show in an experimental situation is outside of the game playing situation. Are people actually going to be more likely to exhibit novel forms of aggression and violence toward other people? That data we don't have. So one of the major problems you have here when you're studying media violence is the fact that human aggressive behavior has multiple causes. Media exposures, whether it's games or TV or streaming or movies or books or whatever, that's only one. Media exposure is only one possible influence. And it's not even the most powerful one. By far, the most powerful influence in terms of your level, your personal level of aggressiveness and violence is the house you were raised in. If people are raised in an environment where violence and aggression are very commonplace, they are significantly more likely to engage in similar behavior, right? So media effects matter, but they're not necessarily the most powerful factor. predicting human violence. Some other variables that are in play when we're looking at media effects is the fact that when we play games or we watch violent media over and over and over and over again, we become kind of numb to it. This isn't a great example, but I remember very clearly when the TV series The Walking Dead first came out. The first few episodes, I was really horrified by the appearance of the zombies and really horrified by the sound effects and the visual effects of killing the zombies, or of the stars of the show getting, beat up and injured and sometimes murdered. At first, it was really horrifying. By the middle of season 1, I was like laughing at it. It wasn't so serious. What that's referred to as is psychic numbing, which is itself associated with the experience of indifference. So when we're repeatedly exposed to media violence, we can become less sensitive to it. So our bodies and our brains just don't react because we see it all the time. So we're less horrified, less disgusted, less concerned, and definitely less empathetic to the victims. So when we react to real life violence, so if you have people with high levels of exposure and they're presented with real life aggression events, they may in fact be indifferent to it. And then we also may become less empathy prone. So we're not as sensitive to the needs of others, to people who need our help, that need our concern. So that can lead to enhanced bystander effects. So if you have been exposed to a ton of media violence, or even just a moderate amount of it, your lack of sensitivity, your lack of reactivity, and your level of indifference go up, and then you become numb to the needs of other people. Now, what are some of the possible explanations of specifically the video game research? Because I know some of you out there are gamers, and I have kids, and one of my kids is a big gamer, and my son-in-law also gamer, and some of the games that they both play are violent video games. So I know that some of you are in that space, so I try to be really clear and careful about the way we interpret the findings. First, we know that exposure to anything violent, whether it's in person or in media, so that includes video game effects, increases our level of physiological arousal and excitement. And from previous chapters, when you're in a physiologically aroused, excited state, you have to look at your surroundings to determine what to call that state and to explain it to yourself. What this can do is trigger this tendency to imitate those hostile, violent characters. So we are an observational species. We're also a very social species. You learn the patterns. You learn the behaviors that other people you see are engaging in. I can remember when my nephews were little, they were watching, their usual Saturday morning. It was when that was still a thing, Saturday morning cartoons. They were watching Power Rangers. And they would watch it, and I'm like, you're probably like, what the heck is Power Rangers? But it was like these people dressed in outfits and doing fake martial arts. So they would have fights. There were fights in every program. So what do my nephews do immediately after? They start mimicking exactly the kind of hostile behavior that they were seeing on the screen. And they would practice it. They would try to be, the best Power Ranger they could. And then, Mutant Teenage Ninja Turtles was kind of the same way. They would watch that, and then they would engage in, their fake turtle martial arts. So it's the same phenomenon there. Playing games or watching other kinds of violent media can activate these aggressive ideas and even the expectations that we might have. So it may make you a little more prone to infer that other people's intentions toward you are actually hostile. And that can be really tricky, particularly for young people. So the boundaries may blur between what is an accurate interpretation of other people's intentions and motives and what's not. So it kind of puts you in this readiness state to become angry or to be provoked. So one of the difficulties that we have in interpreting game effects is that while all these things are true, that physiological arousal goes up, there's a tendency to imitate. There's a tendency to have aggressive ideas and expectations and to model social scripts and so on. Does that necessarily translate into you getting violent with the other people in your atmosphere? Sometimes yes, a lot of the time no. So what do we know about the long-term patterns? Most of this research has been on televised violence, and a lot of it has looked at childhood, impacts in childhood. So what we know is that when we do surveys and interviews, and we track kids across time, and a lot of these, just to be transparent, it's parents filling out surveys, informing researchers on what kind of programs kids are watching, how long they're watching, so how much are they consuming in childhood. And then they go back and follow the kids. The parents keep filling out the surveys while they're still children, and then when they're adults, they go back and look again at their later behavior. One study that's described in your textbook is a longitudinal study of a large number of families, with 700 families over 17 years. And what they found was a correlation. And, be clear, put your critical thinking hat firmly on your head. They found that just watching television, they didn't have any control over what type of content in this particular study. It was just watching television in adolescence predicted those adolescents engaging in violent behavior against others when they were adults. So here's how they did this. They tracked these families over those 17 years. Then they looked at arrest records, and they looked at charges. They looked at incarcerations, and they found a correlation, right? So here's where your critical thinking hat comes into really strong play. What is it about this one variable, TV watching? You could say it's the TV, TV is evil. Or you could be more thoughtful and say aggression is a behavior that has multiple causes. So what happens in families where the TV is overconsumed? Are there characteristics of those families that have high rates of TV watching? Are there other elements that are involved? Are there other characteristics that are predictive in those families of aggression and violence in adulthood? And in fact, there are. There are lots of variables that are highly predictive of violence in adulthood. And some of them have stronger correlations than TV viewing. Does it erase the TV correlation? No, it doesn't. But you shouldn't be so quick to say TV is evil, turn it off, or you're going to turn into a violent zombie. That we do not have evidence to show that. We do have some evidence that viewing more media violence at the beginning of the elementary school year was predictive of more aggressive behavior reports and less prosocial behaviors at the end of the year. So this kind of data, just to help you through the weeds here, this is primarily family reports of the level of TV viewing. And that included estimations of how much media violence was being consumed. So these are elementary school students, so you have to ask the parents what they're watching and how much they're watching. And then you get teacher reports of aggressive behavior, prosocial behavior at the end of the year. And what we find, again, is a predictive relationship. As parent ratings of consumption of media violence go up, aggression at the end of the year goes up, prosocial behavior at the end of the year goes down. Again, it's a correlation. So, is it a fact that the kids who are watching more media violence in the first place are just attracted to it? So they were going to be aggressive no matter what? And their attraction to violent media is because they have a baseline level of aggressiveness that's higher? That's just as likely as saying that the media is causing a change in aggressive behavior. So you have to be super careful when you're interpreting findings like this. One more example of this, heavy television viewers, and this is regardless of age. I think most of this research has been done on adults. Heavy television viewers tend to have a bit more exaggerated view of how much violence there is in the world. And again, this is a correlational finding, but what we know is that when people spend a lot of time doom scrolling, when they watch too much news, when they watch too many crime procedurals, they tend to believe that the world is a far more dangerous and violent place. They also have a greater fear of being assaulted, of being a victim of violent crime. So just to really drive home the point, hopefully, to really drive home the point, you have to be very careful in how you interpret these effects. The effects are there. They are what they are. There is a correlation. What you need to do next, though, is carefully interpret those correlations. Remember how correlations work. There are multiple possible causal relationships between media consumption and aggressive behavior. And they come in multiple forms. The aggression may be explained in terms of aggressive temperament and personality traits. So people who already have a propensity toward violence may prefer to consume violent imagery in their media. It could be true that watching the violent TV does make people more aggressive. It's also entirely likely that some additional set of variables causes changes in both aggressive behavior and choices about viewing violent media. So when we do these experiments, and we look at the experiments and the longitudinal research, what we do know is that the strongest effects, so the strongest correlations, is for people who are already known to exhibit more aggressive, violent behavior. So if you have parent ratings of little kids, and those parents rate those kids as already being pretty aggressive and getting into violent altercations with other kids, and then they're exposed to more of that in the form of media, that's when you get the strongest effects, primarily because it seems to be giving support, validation, permission to acting on those impulses. So you have to be super careful, really pull that critical thinking hat down to your ears and look at the data very carefully. Now you can also ask the question, with what we know about media correlations with aggressive behavior, what are some possible explanations for us? Well, first, having a lot of violent media tends to suggest that there's a norm at the cultural level that says, if they can do it, so can I. So what it's communicating to observers is that they are normatively being permitted to engage in aggressive behavior. I certainly see an awful lot of that in social media. Observational learning is another explanation. So what we're learning is scripts. Bandura showed that very clearly in his research. So that's how you do it, becomes the script for how to respond to provocation. And then there's misattribution. Remember how I said, the fact that when we're playing a really high intensity first-person shooter game, that is very physiologically arousing, and the competition is very physiologically arousing, and you have to make attributions to explain why you feel those things. If you're playing against someone, it's very easy to misattribute those feelings of arousal to being angry with your opponent, for example. And then there's also habituation. When we are overexposed, like I gave you the example of my reaction to The Walking Dead, by the time I got halfway through season 1, I was like, oh, ho hum, there goes another axe through the head of a zombie. It gets kind of boring because you've habituated to the violent imagery. And then finally, there's a self-fulfilling prophecy that may be in play, where what we get is a lot of messages that say you need to be proactively aggressive. You better be aggressive and violent first, or the other guy's going to get you, right? You could add to this that, when we see people, TV characters, movie characters, game characters behaving violently, it may reduce their inhibitions. So if they have a value system that has really kind of shown them that nonviolence is preferred, being exposed to a lot of imagery can weaken that bond. Those learned inhibitions, it can disinhibit people. Sometimes when people in the media are shown behaving violently, it can be triggering to them, and they can put themselves into that situation immersively. That's certainly true with gaming. Identifying with those feelings of anger can become very powerful for us. If we're in the context of trying to interpret those angry feelings, we may make those misattributions and be impacted by priming and so on. So there are lots of possible explanations. I don't think it's enough for us to say, banish all violence from the media. The effects are not that large and powerful. Are they a concern? Yes, because habituation and misattribution and observational learning and norms that suggest it's okay to be brutal, those are all things that can lead to problems for human beings in their relationships. That concludes my coverage of Learning Objective 12.3. In my next video, I'll be covering Learning Objective 12.4, identify ways that aggression can be reduced.